Welcome to the Dionysius Circle Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Sam Bennett. On this podcast, we explore the wisdom of the Eastern Christian Fathers and the philosophical traditions that influence them. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Stephanos Stephanides, a researcher at the University of Cyprus and a graduate of the University of Cambridge, where he completed his PhD in classics. Stephan specializes in the philosophy of Plato, especially the metaphysics of parts and wholes. In this episode, we'll discuss his fascinating article, Reconsidering the Essential Nature and Indestructibility of the Soul in the Affinity Argument of the Phaedo. Together, we examine the Affinity Argument and its exploration of the soul's nature. Is the soul a composite entity made of parts, or is it utterly simple, without parts? And if it were truly simple, would that imply that it is also indestructible? A special thanks to Peter Anthony Togni for letting us feature his beautiful rendition of the hymn Of the Father's Love Begotten from his album Sea Dreams. God bless, and I hope you enjoy the episode. Why don't we just start off? Could you just tell us a little bit about yourself? Maybe perhaps share where you grew up and how you first got interested in philosophy.
Sure. So I grew up in London. I'm originally Greek Cypriot, which might explain my fascination in the ancient world in the past. I was educated in the UK. I did my undergraduate degree at UCL, where I was first introduced to the dialogues of Plato in my second year of my degree. And from then on, really, it was just a kind of love affair with Plato, and not just Plato, with ancient philosophy in general. Like I said, I have a background in classics, which introduced me to all of the different branches of the classical world. But it was really ancient philosophy which interested me the most, and where I felt I kind of had a natural home. And you're right to mention that my PhD was in parts and wholes. I would qualify that slightly to say that it wasn't just about the metaphysics of parts and wholes in Plato. That was something which my PhD addressed, but it was rather about Plato's different conceptual models for elucidating or explaining the coherence of complex items, like the soul, at least in Plato's Republic onwards, the city also being a composite of distinct and potentially opposing parts, the cosmos, and how Plato's conceptual apparatus for elucidating the coherence of these items develops over time. Now, of course, within that discussion, I engage quite a lot with the metaphysics of parts and wholes in Plato, and specifically the Myriology, the study of parts and wholes. And my article on the Affinity Argument kind of falls out of that broader interest in parts and wholes, composite structures in Platonic philosophy. But really, the Fido posed a problem, I guess, to my examination of Plato's interest in complex structures, because Plato seems to be quite interested in the dialogues in these complex structures and explaining how they can become well-ordered wholes specifically. So we're faced with the situation where the soul is a complex of different parts, the city and likewise the cosmos. And Plato is really interested in explaining, despite their internal complexity, how can these items become well-ordered in contrast to the forms which are pure absolute unities. So in the face of this binary distinction, what do we do with these complex items? They're not pure unities like the forms. So how can they become increasingly unified like their counterparts in the forms? And then we're faced with the Fido, where Plato seems to present us with a conception of the soul as an incomposite unity, which sits rather awkwardly with the conception of the soul we find in the Republic. So how does that kind of fit in with Plato's broader interest in these complex items?
Yeah, so on the one hand, it looks like in the Republic, it looks like the soul is not an incomposite unity. In other words, in the Republic, it looks like the soul has parts. In contrast, in the Phaedo, it looks like the soul is supposed to be absolutely simple. In other words, it does not have parts. And in fact, that idea that the soul is simple, lacking parts, for you, this is really crucial to understanding the affinity argument, which is the kind of the topic that we're going to be dealing with today is the affinity argument in the Phaedo. And so maybe we can kind of turn to that. Maybe let's just, for the audience, just to get a quick refresher, what's going on in the Phaedo as a whole, and then what is the position of the affinity argument within that overall structure?
I think it's a good question, and I think it's really interesting to consider the Phaedo as a dialogue in its entirety. The Phaedo is in many ways a very unique dialogue in Plato's thought. I mean, just think about the dramatic context of the dialogue. This is Socrates' last hour. He's about to drink the hemlock, which will send him into the afterlife. And so we're in this kind of very austere, kind of otherworldly context, which is a unique dramatic context in the trajectory of Plato's dialogues. And that austere context, in a way, kind of informs the presentation of Plato's ethics, metaphysics, conception of the soul, psychology that we find in the Fido as well. And so I think it's important to take into consideration the broader dramatic context of the dialogue when reading the Fido generally. We're faced in a context where Socrates is talking about the separation of the soul from the body. We're in this otherworldly context which takes us away from the material world. It's also a really important dialogue insofar as it introduces some quite new ideas into Plato's philosophy as well. Ideas which will have a long-lasting legacy in Plato's dialogues, like the distinction between forms and physical particulars. We have some intimations of what these kind of unchanging entities might be in previous dialogues. Famously, Socrates' what is question, diesti, when thinking about things like justice, piety, etc. But this is the first time, really, where Plato introduces us to his famous theory of forms, which endures, I would say, despite some of the oddities posed by the Parmenides, endures right up until Plato's Timaeus, where we have this same binary distinction or opposition between forms and physical particulars described in quite similar ways. So I kind of take this broader overview of Plato's dialogues, and I think it's helpful to consider the position of the Phaedo within Plato as a whole. And the other thing to say, it also foreshadows some interesting ideas in Plato's later philosophy as well. There, in Socrates' famous autobiography, he introduces this famous nous, as he calls it, talking about Anaxagoras' nous, and it seems that nous there is doing something similar to what Timaeus' craftsman god is doing in the dialogue Timaeus. That deity is also described as nous. So it seems to foreshadow a lot of ideas that come later in a way that makes us wonder whether Plato already had some of these ideas in a kind of proleptic sense from as early as the Phaedo, being this kind of transitionary dialogue from the early dialogues into Plato's middle period dialogues and then into the later dialogues. Now, in terms of the second part of your question on the affinity argument, the affinity argument is just one part of the Phaedo, as I'm sure your audience will be aware. It begins with Socrates' famous defense of the philosophical life and his desire, I would say, to be separated from the body, and his hopes as well for what's to come afterwards. He then goes into presenting some arguments in defense of the immortality of the soul, so that his interlocutors don't really need to fear Socrates' imminent death, and also to kind of inspire them towards the path of philosophy as well. And the first argument he presents is the cyclical argument. I won't go into really kind of discussing that now, since we're focused just on the affinity argument. Although the relationship between some of those different arguments in the overall economy of the dialogue will be important, I'm sure that will come out at a later point. We then go on to the recollection argument, the affinity argument, And then after that, Simmias's famous objection that the soul is a harmonia. Socrates then talks about his own autobiography, how he got into philosophy, and that's where he talks about Anaxagoras, Anaxagoras' nous, and how he was disappointed because rather than explaining how nous ordered all things with a view to the best in this kind of teleological sense, Anaxagoras actually went on to talk about physical explanations. Rather than nous as what truly binds things and holds them together. We then have Cebes' objections, so those two interlocutors, Simmias and Cebes. Then the final argument, which is Socrates' real kind of clinching point, as the final nail in the coffin, excuse the pun. And then Socrates gives us this elaborate myth of the afterlife and this image of the cosmos. And then we go on to Socrates' death and him drinking the hemlock, which is a very moving scene. And I think touches most readers, even today when reading that. So that's just to say, the affinity argument is just one part of a large kind of complexity of ideas that's kind of going on in the Fido.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so, like you said, the people often put it, the philosophical core of this dialogue are those four arguments you mentioned: the cyclical argument, the recollection argument, the affinity argument, or the kinship argument, as David Ebery likes to call it, and then the fourth and final argument, which is, like you said, it's kind of the climax of the dialogue. Although, the most scholarly attention is directed toward the recollection argument, the second argument. But at any rate, we are going to be focusing, like you said, on the affinity argument, that third of the four core arguments. And at this point, we should just kind of refresh the audience's memory, or just give a little quick rendition of the argument. My thought is I'll just briefly describe it, and then you can kind of correct or elaborate on it however you see fit. So basically, the affinity argument, the goal of it is to show that, to Simmias and Cebes, that no, we do not need to be fearful of our soul being destroyed upon death. We can be more like Socrates, who is fearless, apparently, in the face of death, right? So, and the argument goes something like, we should not fear our soul being destroyed, because the soul is in fact similar to the unseen, to the invisible. For example, the transcendent forms, the gods, those are invisible, those are unseen. So the soul is similar to the unseen or the invisible, and the unseen or the invisible cannot be destroyed. And so thanks to this similarity or kinship between the unseen and the soul, we don't need to be fearful that our soul will be destroyed once we die. So obviously that's a very rough sketch of the argument. So Doctor, is there anything you would want to add to that? Anything just any initial thoughts on that? Really?
I don't necessarily object to the sketch, although I think certain things should be highlighted or mentioned if they weren't already mentioned there. The first being that it's important to focus a lot on how the affinity argument is framed. So you began by saying that it kind of falls out of this fear, this childish fear from Socrates' interlocutors that the soul will be destroyed upon death. Now, biological death in the Fido is conceived as the separation of the body from the soul. And the interlocutors don't necessarily object to that. What they're fearful of is what happens to the soul itself after the separation of the soul from the body, which is what I'm calling biological death. And specifically, Simmias and Cebes seem to be afraid that the soul will somehow be dispersed. If you have knowledge of the Greek, it's really interesting to look at the specific words that Plato uses here. He seems to be using words which give us a conception of the idea as give us a conception of the soul as a kind of material entity which can be dispersed or scattered apart. So uh, it's within those specific fears of the soul being scattered or dissolved, specifically in that way, that the affinity argument emerges. So then Socrates, so it's important to keep that in mind, because I also think that within the overall economy of the dialogue, we spoke about those different arguments that Socrates presents for the immortality of the soul. It seems to me that the affinity argument is the only argument amongst all of those which directly addresses this concern of the soul being of such a kind that it will be dispersed upon biological death, taken apart, scattered into the winds. So then Socrates goes on to say, well, look, is the soul the sort of thing which is then likely to be scattered in its essential nature? What kind of thing should we be fearful that thing could be actually dispersed or scattered?
Right. It's an interesting move. It's like they're worried about it getting scattered, but then he kind of takes a step back and asks, well, what kind of things in
Right,
general
right.
either can be scattered or are likely to be scattered? And is the soul one of those kinds of things? So, yeah, anyway, sorry.
Yeah, what kind of thing? And this idea of what kind of thing uh, introduces us to this kind of dichotomy between certain objects, which are encompassed really by the forms, the category of the forms, the category of the unchanging. Socrates goes on to introduce two kinds, and the category of the changing, the visible, the material, etc. But before even really bringing up that category, and this is something that your reconstruction kind of glossed over, Socrates says, well, what sort of thing is liable to be scattered? And he introduces this distinction between composite and incomposite entities. And it's really that distinction that I'm interested in this article, and that I think needs to be taken more into consideration when thinking about the affinity argument, the Fido, and the soul's essential indestructibility and immortality.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So your paper really kind of delves deep into this distinction between composite things, things that have parts, and incomposite things, things that lack parts, that are perfectly one, such as the forms. And like you said, that distinction is introduced early in the affinity argument. Yeah, at the very beginning, right? And 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 as you go into the argument, it's almost somewhat puzzling, what happens to this distinction. But at any rate, your reconstruction really emphasizes that distinction. We will delve into that further in a moment.
So he introduces that distinction, and then he goes on to talk about those entities that were earlier introduced in the recollection argument, namely the forms. And then he goes on to give us this binary distinction between ontological entities like the forms versus things that aren't the forms. But it's important to note that this distinction between composite and incomposite entities comes before that. So it seems to be Socrates' real kind of classic way of introducing this distinction and thinking about the relationship between these two kinds, between the forms and physical particulars on the other hand. So he's already inviting us to consider this distinction as being pertinent to the distinction between two different kinds of entities.
Good. And so let's kind of like touch on, what we might say is the thesis of your paper. So this is something David Embry talks about as well. This argument, the affinity argument, is often criticized as one of the weakest arguments Plato presents in the Phaedo. But you disagree with that. And it seems like the thesis, of your paper could be that it's actually a plausible argument for the immortality of the soul. So let's get into, we've already kind of touched, it's going to have to do with understanding this distinction between the composite and incomposite. But yeah, can you just roughly say, why is the affinity argument often dismissed as a weak argument? And then what are people missing? What is it that they are missing about this argument?
most commentators seem to kind of dismiss the affinity argument for a variety of different reasons. On one extreme, it's kind of taken as a failed demonstration of how to argue for the immortality of the soul. And that seems to really, most of the criticisms, but that one in particular, seems to uh, arise from the fact that how the argument itself is structured in this kind of analogical way by saying, by introducing these two different ontological kinds and saying, well, the soul is more like one of those kinds, and on the basis of that resemblance, we shouldn't be fearful that the soul is the kind of thing to be dispersed. So Socrates seems to be arguing for the immortality of the soul in that analogical way, and some commentators find.
And sorry to interrupt, but it's kind of a funny sort of argument, right? It's you almost gloss over it. Maybe if the listeners are hearing what I said, right? You almost assume that I said the argument is that the soul is unseen, it is invisible, and therefore since invisible, unseen things are not destroyed, the soul won't be destroyed. But no, it's actually,
Yeah,
like you said, it's analogical. It's
mm,
it's something like the soul has a similarity to the unseen. It's akin to the invisible. It has an affinity
yeah.
with the unseen and invisible. And that sort of analogical language is fairly bizarre. Sorry, but just or surprising, something like that. Yeah.
One way to put it, philosophically underwhelming, maybe, or not very kind of promising as a way to kind of do philosophical argument. Now, obviously, I argue for a less kind of analogical. I appreciate that Plato does have his reasons for uh, doing the argument in this way. And it might be that he's also deliberately doing it in that way and kind of inviting uh, an element of doubt on behalf of his readership and wider audience. But I think kind of reading between the lines, and really thinking about this distinction between two ontological kinds and what that binary distinction seems to be doing, why Plato's introducing that binary distinction, and thinking about where the soul is placed within that distinction in a less analogical way. I think that's a promising direction to go down. And you haven't mentioned it so far, but one part of my argument is also looks at kind of these less analogical ways of reading the affinity argument, which were very popular amongst the Neoplatonists and the Neoplatonic reception of the affinity argument, which perhaps we'll go on to discuss later on. But that seems to be one of the main reasons why it's dismissed. Some commentators say, well, look, there seems to be obvious gaps or flaws in the argument, so maybe we should think of its function in slightly different ways. Maybe it should be taken more as a kind of ethical argument for why the soul ought to practice philosophy, what the rewards of practicing philosophy are, the dangers of not practicing philosophy are, and I think that's right to think about the kind of broader function of the affinity argument and to think of all of those different elements. But I wouldn't want to focus on that at the expense of the kind of plausibility of the affinity argument itself, and of that distinction that Socrates introduces at the beginning between composite and incomposite entities. So there are a variety of ways, yeah. And I think no one has really, just thinking about the literature here, the kind of broader scope and landscape here of the literature, no one has really attempted to give the distinction between composite and incomposite entities the attention that it deserves. And so this paper is kind of revisiting that distinction in an original way. So
Yeah, absolutely, and it really is fascinating how to look at this argument once you really emphasize that distinction. And so, yeah, maybe we can also I'll just briefly highlight something that you just mentioned, which is that a kind of a second or a further really interesting part of your paper is that you are kind of resuscitating, I don't know what the word, revitalizing, whatever you want to call it, returning to a more Neoplatonic reading of the affinity argument. So the type of argument that your reconstruction of the affinity argument in certain ways is very much continuous with the Neoplatonic tradition of reading that argument. And maybe we can get back to that point later on. But for now, let's just think a little bit more about what you call the CI distinction, the composite, incomposite distinction. And just, we've already touched on this, but let's just talk about, okay, what does it mean to be composite? What does it mean to be incomposite? And then for the listeners, just a few examples of things that are composite versus incomposite.
Yeah. So the distinction is between composite and incomposite entities, as you say. The Greek for that is syntheton versus the asyntheton, the composite and the incomposite. The way I understand that distinction, the way I understand those words, it is quite simple, really. Syntheton meaning to contain parts, to be composed of parts, and asyntheton to be without parts. And it's really that analysis of syntheton, asyntheton, and that understanding of composite and incomposite as being with or without parts that plays a key role in my argument, in my analysis of the affinity argument. Another thing to say really is that in terms of thinking of the examples, right, that you kind of invited me to talk about, really we're talking about kind of anything material, anything in the material world. Some people might find that unconvincing, thinking about everything in the material world as being composed of parts. But remember that the material world for Plato is a fundamentally generated entity. It's a created entity. And there's reason to think that created entities for Plato just do have parts. And specifically, the way they're created is in such a way that they have parts which are kind of put together in a certain way. So really we're thinking about anything generated, anything material, specific examples, I mean, intuitive examples. We might think of a house being made up of different parts, bricks, mortar, etc. But in other contexts, like the Republic, for example, when Plato talks about syntheta, composite items, he also includes there things like clothing, things like clothing, a house. What else does he use? Really anything kind of created, generated. I mean, the city itself is also a complex of distinct parts. That's more of a kind of conceptual item, let's say. But anything physical, you can think of my clothing, my robe being made up of different parts, my house being made up of different parts.
Yeah, I mean, one idea, is like when it comes to, well, first off, it's interesting that connection you're drawing between being created and being a composite. We'll have to kind of dive into that a little bit further because that's an interesting idea. But yeah, just the idea that, if you think about something material, for one thing, normally it seems like every material thing is going to be kind of extended in space to some degree. And anything that's extended, well, then you can divide it. And if it's divisible, if you can divide something, then it at least is going to have the different parts after the division. Could you kind of just give a rough sense of, what's the pull for thinking that a form, whatever it is, the form of beauty, what's the intuition or the pull for thinking that lacks parts?
Yeah, there seems to be two things there. The first is a kind of metaphysical consideration. Why think of forms as being without parts? Well, within the affinity argument and within Plato's thought in general, that seems to be one of the reasons why these forms are eternal and therefore indestructible. So that's kind of the initial pull, maybe, for thinking from a metaphysical perspective, for thinking of forms as being without parts in composite entities.
So it's an explanation of indestructibility. We'll get into that further, but this idea that it's because the thing lacks parts that it can be eternal and indestructible.
Right. And speaking of the forms as incomposite entities reveals something distinctive about these items. It tells us something about them and specifically about what sort of items they are and why they are indestructible entities. So that's a metaphysical perspective. From a more ethical perspective, why it might be helpful or interesting to think about forms as being incomposite entities. And I like your example of the form of beauty, because it seems to reveal something about the kind of pure simplicity of these items, that the form of beauty just is beauty in every single way. And having any sort of internal variety or part that might be just in a kind of very small way not beautiful would affect the kind of purity of beauty that that item possesses. So it seems to be the case that any sort of internal variety or differentiation in the form of parts would just affect the kind of goodness of what these items represent. Whether that thing be beauty or justice, you don't want a part of injustice in justice, otherwise that would affect its purity of justice, if you like. So those are the kind of two reasons why, Plato might be wanting us to think about forms as incomposite entities, and why intuitively we might want to think of certain transcendent items, whether they're forms, whether they're other kinds of divinities, depending on what metaphysical or religious framework you're coming from. It might be helpful to think of these transcendent entities as being without parts.
Great. So let's now, why is it that Socrates is introducing the distinction between composite and incomposite? Well, it looks like he's trying to get a handle on what kind of entities can be dispersed, what kind of entities cannot be dispersed. And as we already indicated before, it's because Simmias and Cabes, they're worried that the soul is going to get dispersed by the wind. We're going to die, the soul will separate from the body, and then the wind will come and just kind of blow the soul into many little individual parts, kind of thing. It's going to get dispersed. And so Socrates' response is, okay, well, what kind of things actually can be dispersed in the first place? And so he's trying to get a handle on that. So can you kind of connect that for us? What's the relationship between being composite and incomposite and capable of being dispersed or incapable? Yeah.
Right. So Plato's thought seems to be that anything with parts is in principle liable to being kind of destroyed. And so it's a natural place for him to look at this distinction between composite and incomposite entities, since we're interested in the sort of thing that's liable to be dispersed and that's not liable to be dispersed. And Plato's thought seems to be that anything with parts is by definition liable to be broken up. I spoke a moment ago about this all kind of material entities, the created world itself, anything within the created world. And so on the other side of that argument, you have these incomposite entities which are not made up of parts. And Plato's thought seems to be that anything which kind of doesn't have parts isn't liable to be destroyed. Now, where does the idea of change come into it? Well, you might think of change in the case of composite entities as denoting the change or internal rearrangement of certain parts within a composite structure, and that change eventually leading to complete destruction or death in the case of the soul if it was a composite entity. So the connection between changing and being composite seems to amount specifically to this internal rearrangement of parts, like, for instance, the human body. Being made up of a composite of different elements, at least that's the way that the ancients seem to think of biology, the four different humours, and kind of change within the level of the organic body, eventually leading to old age, decay, and destruction, being due to some kind of change of those of those internal parts, some sort of internal rearrangement, and disease as well, as amounting to those parts being organized in a certain way or being reorganized in a certain way. Incomposite entities don't suffer from this. They don't, because they don't have parts. They that's kind of bolsters one reason why they don't change and why they are eternal and indestructible entities, because they don't have parts.
Yeah, it's so interesting. So many things to think about. I mean, so one thing to think about, like, okay, so there's one idea of if something has parts, it is liable to be destroyed. I'd be curious what you mean by liable there. I mean, one idea is if something has parts, it's possible, it has the potential to be destroyed. Now, another idea, though, is that if something has parts, necessarily it will be destroyed. So not only does it have the potential at any time to be destroyed, but really it will come to pass eventually. And so, at any rate, I mean, the relevance of this really quickly is just like, for example, if the soul turns out to have parts, well, maybe it could be destroyed because of those parts, but maybe it will never be destroyed for some reason. On the other hand, if it has parts, maybe it's necessarily it will be destroyed eventually. So, at any rate, I don't know if you want to comment on that at all. Just this issue of like can be destroyed versus necessarily will to be destroyed.
Yeah, I mean that's actually the way in which Socrates kind of introduces the distinction in the first place. He invites us to think about what kind of thing is kind of likely to be scattered, what kind of thing is not likely to be scattered, and that being composite and a compound by nature being liable to be split up into its parts, and only that which is incomposite, if anything, not liable or likely to be split up. So one might say that liability for X doesn't denote kind of the actual realization of X. So I might have a liability. We often say of people that they have a liability to do certain things. It might be the case that despite that propensity or likelihood or liability, they never end up actually doing that thing. So liability might not be kind of doing enough. It might not be strong enough. And I think that going back to the kind of standard criticism of the affinity argument and the analogical structure of the affinity argument, this language is one of the reasons why people find this distinction and the affinity argument in general kind of unconvincing. But there might be another way to kind of read that language of liability. It might be that Plato is saying, for what kind of thing is it apt or appropriate, we could say, for being destroyed or not destroyed. So, and composite and incomposite entities seem to fit that criteria, right? In terms of for what kinds of thing it's appropriate and for what kind of thing it would be not appropriate. So that doesn't deny the possibility that eventually, that thing is not just liable, but it's kind of actually a genuine kind of outcome at some point.
If an incomposite thing is not liable to be destroyed in the sense of it doesn't even have that potential, then if the soul were to be incomposite, we would secure the strong metaphysical kind of strong result that you're referring to, rather than just an analogical kind of like, well, the soul is like something that can't be destroyed, so presumably the soul won't be destroyed. Okay, good. Let's move on to this. I mean, I want to just highlight really. I mean, just I want to be mindful of the time, but it seems like one idea here is that if you have parts, that entails the potential to change, and which we were mentioning earlier, that potential for rearrangement, and then that potential for rearrangement that opens the door for destruction. So it seems like anything with parts, it's always going to have this door open to destruction via change. Now, I just really quick want to throw out like, an objection or just what would you say to something like this where, it's like, okay, if we're talking about material things with their material parts, I can see how parts opens up changeability and opens up destruction. I just see that kind of intuitively or whatever. But if we're talking about like an abstract item that has parts, I mean, so for example, what about the idea that like if you think about the definition of a human being, at least the traditional definition, it's, on the one hand, we got some rationality, we have some animality, put it together, we have rational animal. So it looks like, it seems like maybe there's two parts to the definition of a human being. And so that's an abstract object, the definition of humanity, potentially. And there it looks like it has parts, but there it looks like, that's an abstract object that could never change. So anyway, I'm just kind of curious, like, what do you think about the idea that, look, with material things,
Okay. I think what you're referring to is kind of conceptual parts. So you can think of forms having these more conceptual parts, but as a lot of commentators have noticed when looking at Plato's, Plato hasn't kind of got that far yet, really. Aristotle has a much more sophisticated apparatus for describing parts and wholes and what these kind of things are, what they entail. When Plato is talking about parts, I think he's referring to them in these kind of concretely material terms. So a part as being something kind of material. I mean, one objection to that is the different parts of the state in the Republic. They don't seem to be, the different social classes. They don't seem to be material entities. That's true. And yet the ideal state is actually dissoluble and does have an expiry date and will dissolve by virtue of some relation between its parts. But at some level, those different classes are made up of human beings, of material things in some level. So the idea of part for Plato, I think, signifies something concrete, something material. So it would be it would be interesting to think about these more abstract items as potentially having parts but not being destructible because of these more kind of conceptual parts. But Plato seems to be interested in the abstract items for him are the forms. And to talk of the forms as having parts would signify that they have kind of material parts by virtue of which they could be liable to be destroyed in the strong sense of actually being destroyed or actually being destructible. Yeah.
Okay, great. That's fair. Okay. Good. Okay. So we've kind of briefly gone into the kind of the fascinating physical issues related to the CI distinction, the composite incomposite distinction. At this point, maybe we can just think about, where does this take us in terms of the goal of the affinity argument, right? The affinity argument, he's trying to allay the fears of his interlocutors. He's trying to say, look, we do not have to fear that upon death, the soul will be destroyed. So how does, it seems like the way that, I mean, I guess, it just seems pretty obvious what the next move is. It's to prove that the soul is an incomposite thing, because that would allay the fear. So is that how the argument goes? Does Socrates end up proving that the soul is incomposite, or, just can you take us to the next step here?
So so that's kind of two different aspects or parts of my paper, if you like. It's this distinction between composite and incomposite entities, and Socrates introducing that distinction for helping us think about what sort of thing is liable to be destroyed, what sort of thing is not liable to be destroyed, and inviting us to consider these two different kinds and to already think, well, what kind does the soul fit into? And the strong kind of supposition seems to be that, and many commentators seem to take Plato to be suggesting that the soul just is an incomposite entity, and because of its essential incompositeness, it's therefore indestructible. And that is the way that the Neoplatonists read it. That's the way that kind of reading beneath the lines, if you will, or taking a bit more of a brave approach to reading the Affinity Argument. That's the way that I think it could be taken, and the way that I kind of present it here. The problem with all of that is, of course, the second, or the kind of main part of the Affinity Argument, by virtue of its very name, is that Plato doesn't ever really say the soul is incomposite in those explicit terms. Uh, he says that the soul is like these incomposite entities, like the forms. It's like the category of the invisible, immaterial, unchanging, purely uniform. It's like that. But being like something doesn't necessarily entail being exactly the same as that thing. And that's the kind of major objection, or kind of pitfall of the Affinity Argument, if you like, is that it introduces this distinction. It wants to imply that the soul is incomposite, and on the basis of that internal nature, it's not the sort of thing that's liable to be destroyed, so as to allay the fears of Simmias and Cebes. But then Socrates doesn't say that. He says the soul is like the forms. And on the basis of that likeness, he concludes at the end of the argument, therefore the soul is therefore altogether indissoluble, or nearly so. And that nearly and that nearly seems to kind of open up some reasonable doubt. If it's nearly indestructible, then in some level, if we take Plato's principle of dissolubility seriously, and his view of composite and incomposite entities, and his view of destruction and change, etc., if we take that seriously, then if it's nearly indissoluble, that leaves open some reasonable doubt that maybe the soul does have parts. But does it have parts, or does it not have parts? And I think that's what we really need to think about. So there are other reasons why Plato might be leaving the argument open in this kind of open-ended way. He might feel that further argumentation is still needed. He might want to kind of play on those fears a bit more, notwithstanding the strong supposition that the soul really is incomposite. He might want to leave room for the final argument. He might just have bigger fish to fry. I mean, there's the ethical part of the argument as well that we haven't even discussed yet. But that's the kind of main criticism of the Affinity Argument, kind of how it ends, and why really, on the basis of reading the Affinity Argument, we can't really conclude that the soul is this incomposite entity. There seems to be, doubt.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's fascinating. So, I mean, just to highlight a couple points. So, one thing that's interesting is like, okay, he sets up the distinction in composite. The incomposite seems to be indestructible. And so you're expecting, okay, now here we're going to do an argument where we, show, a sub-argument where we show that the soul is one of those incomposite things. Instead, we just get an argument that it's like an incomposite thing. Now, it's interesting to think about, well, what would be the argument that the soul just is an incomposite thing? That might be, how would we go about arguing that? It's not clear what you would do. So it's like, maybe this is just the best thing we can do. I mean, maybe we don't have available just a straight up proof that the soul is incomposite. So what's the next best thing? You just show that the soul is very much akin to all those incomposite things, and thus, it's probable, it's likely that the soul is incomposite. Anyway, I just throw that out there as like, it's kind of interesting to think about, do we really have that straightforward proof that the soul is incomposite?
Although I don't think it's enough for Plato to just say to just say it's like, or it's strongly akin. I think Plato really wants, I think Plato wants something stronger than that, even though he doesn't explicitly give us that.
Sure. I think ideally, yeah, we would get that, but it's interesting to think about what would that proof look like. Maybe it's just too hard. We can't figure it. Do we know whether the soul? Do we have a direct possibility for a direct proof that the soul is? That's what I was
right. Just thinking about it intuitively, though. I mean, Socrates introduces these two kinds, the two different ontological kinds, right? And really, I mean, the way I read it and the way that the Neoplatonists read it as well, is introducing these two kinds. And the soul just has to fit, this is a binary distinction. We're not really told of any kind of third intermediary entities. Perhaps it's the soul insofar as it's like the forms and sometimes like, maybe like, entities from the material ontological kind. But I think to say that the soul is like the forms, really, he's saying that, well, to be like, resemblance entails identity in a kind of stronger way. We have these two kinds, and what we're really thinking about is of which kind does the soul.
Okay, got you. Okay, I got you. So it's like one idea is that actually by establishing resemblance in this instance, at least, we actually thereby do achieve that proof that the soul is an incomposite thing. So maybe establishing resemblance doesn't always constitute identity. I don't know, maybe it does, but at least in this case, potentially.
Yeah, let me say something as well about maybe why, I said a moment ago that Plato seems to leave it in this open-ended way by saying the soul is completely indissoluble or nearly or very close to it. And why the soul and why it might be helpful for Plato to think about the soul as being akin to the forms but not exactly like them. Let's think about the ethical kind of function of the affinity argument as well. I think that will bring us nicely to some of the other questions you had in the rest of the talk. Plato doesn't seem to want to say or just take it for granted that the soul is completely like the forms, because if it was like it, then it would just enjoy a blessed existence all the time. It would be with the forms all the time. So he seems to kind of leave it open, say, well, it's like the forms, where I read that in the strong sense of having the same essential nature as the forms and being incomposite like the forms. But it's not always like the forms in absolutely every respect, because sometimes it does change. It goes from being wise to ignorant, from being ignorant to wise. It undergoes various kind of other qualitative changes over time, and so at least the impure soul does not seem to be absolutely like the forms in every single respect. So this seems to kind of exhort us towards the path of philosophy, so that we can really become like the forms in absolutely every respect. Now, the problem, not necessarily a problem, despite that exhortative function, the soul still needs to have some sort of basic indestructibility, some sort of similarity or identification with the forms as being essentially incomposite. You can't think of it being like the incomposite, maybe, kind of change between its maybe having parts or not having parts, because if it has parts, then it's liable to be destruction in the strong sense of actually being destroyed. So in its essential nature, the way I read it, I interpret it, it really is, of the same metaphysical kind as the forms, but it doesn't always live a pure, unadulterated, life of goodness as the forms seem to enjoy. So he's exhorting us to become more and more and more like the forms, despite the fact that within our internal configuration, like the forms, we don't have parts.
Right. And you actually kind of describe this, all the ethical language, as kind of constituting the greatest threat to your strong reading of the affinity argument. And I want to be sensitive to time here, but yeah, do you want to just, to kind of identify, you mentioned the ethical language is kind of almost threatening your strong reading. Could you kind of explain that for us briefly?
Yeah, I mean, in some places, for instance, Socrates seems to describe the soul as being, interspersed with the corporeal, or gathering itself together, which seems to imply that it maybe, how does it gather itself together? By making its parts increasingly unified. And this idea, Socrates' language of the soul being polluted by the body, grown in the body, interspersed with the corporeal, seems to signify some sort of threat to the soul's essential nature as being perhaps without parts, incomposite. That's the threat that.
Because if it's material, it seems like straightforwardly it's going to be
if it's
composite,
material,
like we discussed earlier. Yeah.
If it becomes more like the composite and it becomes interspersed with the body, which is a composite entity, then that might affect its internal structure. It seems to me that the soul can still be an incomposite unity in its essential nature, and still kind of bear the scars of embodiment, or still have a propensity towards the body, or still be kind of mixed up with the body in such a way that it retains its essential nature as being an incomposite entity. The ancients did an experiment of water and wine, kind of mixing them together and then actually separating them again after that. So the water doesn't seem to kind of lose its kind of purity, let's say, as water. And maybe that might be one conceptual framework to go down, to say that the soul doesn't lose its essential nature, despite the fact that it becomes more like the body and becomes increasingly attached to the body. It still doesn't get destroyed or die. It just undergoes various reincarnations. So what's keeping it together? Its essential indestructibility. It's basic indestructibility. The fact that it's not a composite entity. But notwithstanding that, it still kind of inclines towards the bodily. It mixes itself up with the bodily, but despite that, doesn't die, just undergoes various subsequent reincarnations.
I mean, and so what do you think about the idea that, this interspersal, this becoming, kind of mingling with the body of the soul, which is supposed to be kind of like the ethical thing to avoid. We want to avoid that. Yeah. Instead, we want to kind of keep our souls pure, not intermixed. What about the idea that, really this is metaphorical language for the soul desiring the body? In other words, the soul becomes impure in the sense that its desires, its interests, these non-physical things are kind of directed toward the corporeal. What do you think about
that's kind of similar to the argument that I was presenting. That might be one promising way to go down. I don't object to that. I think gotcha. That could retain the soul's essential indestructibility. As for the soul actually being material or having parts, being composite, being extended in space, etc., I should say that the argument I'm presenting is restricted to the Fido itself. Plato, of course, writes many other dialogues, and in later dialogues, and this is really quite an important point for reading the Fido, reading the Affinity Argument, thinking about the relationship between the Fido and the Affinity Argument to later Platonic dialogues. Plato does, in the Timaeus, say that the soul, not just the composite soul, but the rational kind of immortal part of the soul itself, is a composite entity. It is made up of parts, because everything is created except God, who is purely ungenerated and unchanging. God created the rational soul as a composite of three distinct parts, being sameness and difference. And note that in the Timaeus, when Plato does introduce this discussion of the generation of the soul and the generation of the lesser gods, the kind of cosmic planetary gods, he says that because of their having parts and being generated, they are in principle dissoluble. However, they will never be dissolved, despite the fact that by virtue of having parts that they are in principle dissoluble. They won't be dissolved through the goodwill of God. So it could, going back to the affinity argument, it could be that the soul is a composite entity, despite this strong supposition that it isn't, but that but despite its liability, because it's it has the potential, it doesn't. But then Plato needs to tell us, well, what is that other thing then that keeps the soul together? And I think Plato's aims in the dialogue are to really prove the essential basic indestructibility of the soul. So it's being incomposite and just not subject to kind of ever being destroyed. So he doesn't talk about, he does talk about nous in the autobiographical section as being that which truly binds all things together. So it could be that nous, as nous does in the Timaeus, is that which binds all things together, but he doesn't go in that direction there. So that's just to say that he is leaving himself open to the possibility that maybe not in the Fido, but in the Republic. Again, he brings up this distinction in Book 10 of the Republic, which also I invite your audience to look at Book 10 of the Republic and the immortality of the soul there, and the argument for the immortality of the soul there, where Plato once again introduces this distinction, and he says it's unlikely for composite items to be eternal, but it's not impossible. So he's leaving himself open that there could be a case where we do have certain composite items of parts which do not in fact ever get destroyed. And the Timaeus takes that up and says, well, yes, we do have composite entities like the soul, like the world, like the lesser god. They are in principle dissoluble, but they won't ever get dissolved because of the goodwill of God. In the Fido, we're not within the framework. We're in a different framework altogether, where Plato really wants to kind of argue for the basic indestructibility of the soul. So it's helpful to really think of the broader picture here of Plato's views on composition, incomposition, and really that's what I tried to do in an earlier draft of this paper, but it was necessarily too long, and I needed to restrict the scope. But for a future inquiry, it would be really helpful to kind of bring these different threads together.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's a really fascinating set of issues, and I want to be sensitive of our time here, and just thank you so much for having this discussion with us. I highly recommend all the listeners that they check out your article, and hopefully, yeah, maybe a future article where you go even further into these issues. As we close, is there anything you want to emphasize? I mean, there's a fascinating discussion of Plotinus in the article, of other Neoplatonic readings, but is there anything to close that you'd like to emphasize at this point?
Well, I mean, just very, very briefly, again, being sensitive of time, just to think of the Neoplatonists and their reading of the Affinity Argument. They take it in this much stronger sense that the soul is not just like the forms; it's really of the same metaphysical, certain Neoplatonists, of the same kind as the forms. And they do take this composite, incomposite distinction seriously. And they have this stronger sense of the soul as kind of really being of the same kind. They read the Affinity Argument in a less analogical way. And I guess what I'm saying is it's not implausible to do that. It's a worthy undertaking to kind of take that risk. And I think I tend to sometimes read Plato in that way, in a less kind of superficial way, and to think more as a Platonist as such, and to put my mind in that framework of Platonism itself, and to think about, well, what are the assumptions in the text? What can we kind of feed off, and really thinking about Plato in this more doctrinal sense. So I see myself sometimes as doing something similar, maybe in the way that I read Plato in this Neoplatonic way, and generally being inspired by Plato just as a final point, generally being inspired by Plato, not just as an exegete, but also reading those ideas to kind of help us really think about the broader underlying ethical considerations of Plato's arguments, how to live life today, the relevance of Plato today, the relevance of these arguments. So other than those final points, I guess I just wanted to thank you as well for the invitation. I've really enjoyed, like I said, it's been a while since I've looked at this article. So thank you for.
Well, you could tell
Thank you for bringing me back to it. And I appreciate the invitation. I hope your audience find the discussion helpful or meaningful in some way. And I'm open to questions or comments from any of your audience members. But it's been a real pleasure, Samuel. So thank you very much for the invitation. And
yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Stephanides. I really appreciate it. And yes, again, to those listening, please check out an excellent article, Reconsidering the Essential Nature and Indestructibility of the Soul in the Affinity Argument of the Phaedo. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.